in all of this, there is invariably and most commonly a disproportionate impact that is meted out and experienced by women, but the lens through which this struggle is viewed, assessed, analyzed, or rated tends to be forgotten. We heard about it during the messages of solidarity, that there's very little that tends to be reported or put in the public domain around this lens. So perhaps just as a flavor, you've written a very wonderful piece on the role of the memory in reflecting through the reparations through a feminist lens. Perhaps you could just share with us, how is that contributing, or how should we use that kind of approach to the conversations that we're having here this week?
Thank you, Jason. Greetings to everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to share some of our reflections to the organizers. I want to maybe begin answering that question by going through a few points in the paper. I'd like to begin with the governing story form that constitutes the resurgence of the call and the demand for reparations. Are we attempting to critically yield and repatriate from the past gains and demands of various revolutionary movements and moments, or is the invitation to search at these demands in a present rethinking of what the conceptual and the material point is for the resurgence, for the call of reparations that we ourselves are seeking to tell? What are the new perspectives about power that haunt us? And what has time taught us to anticipate about this resurgent demand? What does reparations become for us when the past persists in the present? How does a reparative story unfold when overcoming the past means something totally different, and it is less about freedom through a particular overdetermined revolutionary path, say in Frantz Fanon or Walter Rodney's revolutionary and development paths, and it is rather but a kind of repairing of the past? What kind of decisions can we make from a policy perspective that are undergirded by a feminist practice of care, attuned to the full sensorial meaning of the stakes that our African lives navigate every day? I'd like for us to sit a bit with the tensions and the contradictions in the Herero and Namibian ongoing reparations case, as a way of maybe answering some of the questions that come out of this. One of the arguments held up against cultural sovereignty of the indigenous population of Namibia, this specific indigenous population, followed that the Namibian government has a policy of one people, one nation. And any exercise of influence to enter into negotiations with other representatives of the Namibian community would amount to a violation of the sovereignty of the Republic of Namibia. In this moment, the Herero and Nama are denied nuance. They are denied direct representation and a framework that holds the perspectives and institutional memory as direct descendants of survivors. They were left with what is called, or at least what I call, generated division between those who decided to join the process and dissenting members who felt that such a process undermined their persisting past. The constructed oversights in the Namibian German process include the exclusion of a gender-centered and feminist perspective that positions the voices and experiences of Herero and Nama women. We are inundated with devastating accounts of widespread sexual violence, dehumanizing forms of labor directed at women, and coercive power relations that interrupt the lives of women during this genocide. These are non-economic losses, or non-economic oversights rather, that are deeply material in how they offend women's bodies, their psychological and their spiritual lives. I really hold on to Jamaican intellectual Professor David Scott and his language when he says we need to refuse the conformism of the prevalent conceptions of reparations that does nothing to address the questions of the transformation of structures of social economic order. That being said, we need to repair reparations with a radical feminist ethic and the revolutionary memory that gave birth to the promises of independence despite the unfulfilled fate. Pan-African feminist praxis is a tender, riotous, analytical, riotous, tender practice that is devoted to what it feels like to be alive in the worlds that have been disappeared from the historical record and are sidelined from official memory. These worlds include historical and ongoing unpaid labor, significant gender-based wage gaps, devastating rituals of gender-based violence, and loss of economic control and land rights through colonial laws that barred women from ownership. A Pan-African feminist praxis privileges modes of analysis that invite these worlds into the politics of knowledge formation, policy making, and activist choreographies of struggling towards a new world. Pan-African feminist praxis provides an architectural language that builds parallels between economic loss and non-economic loss that colonialism and slavery produced. It attends to unpaid care work as an ongoing and increasing crisis as African governments continue to incur foreign debt that privileges terms and conditions that reduce the government's social spending. We are witnesses to the responsibilities that are thrust upon caregivers when infrastructures of care deteriorate. We have also witnessed how proximity to domestic and gender-based violence increases in unequal countries in the broader global south. We are familiar with how structural neglect burdens and injures the mental, the spiritual, and social lives of women and girls. We've watched young girls and boys fall prey to failing educational systems. We've watched the youth of this continent live through an economic presence of uncertainty and self-directed survival strategies. Professor Lynn Osome's groundbreaking work invites us into a materialist feminist historical analysis through her reading of how our development paths shape reproductive power. Pan-African feminist praxis, if it is to be radical, roots concerned, must queer the normative grounds that define policy. Policy is a political framework that shapes our human actions, institutionality, and governmentality. Queerness as a political orientation is a political orientation that unbounds and unsettles the parameters that define normative policy conditioning. And you have radical scholars in South Africa like Hugo Gakanam, who describes queerness as being positioned improperly in relation to dominant social codes. It is a critique that positions deviancy, refusal, and waywardness as a rightful posture to take up in our discursive and in our praxis-driven response to what we need policy to do regarding reparations. And I also believe that this is a very feminist way of thinking. It's not just a gender approach. Put differently, it is not about what reparations should say within a policy framework, and rather what does policy become to us in relation to reparations. We are being invited into a different way of thinking about policy as an indispensable, albeit limited political tool that also needs epistemological repair. I think I'll hold it right there for now. Maybe anything else we can have a discussion.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Nombuso, for that framing. And I think it's extremely important for us to appreciate how critical the difference in approach and the appreciation for the perspective that you're putting on the table for us to be, very much cognizant that it's an important cog in the wheel in the analysis, in the framing, but also in the narrative that is being set for us to appreciate how we then collectively build a united and common discussion and voice around reparations and reparative justice. I did like also the piece, and I think that the paper is available on the conference website, so I do encourage us to, when you do have a quiet moment, to read through the paper, because it's phenomenal, where you bring out the comparison between what's happening in the Caribbean and what is needed to happen here on the continent. And I think that's also something that has echoed very strongly throughout this morning, particularly in the keynote session and in the messages of solidarity.